She stood shivering under the searing spotlight of Madison Square Garden, draped in nothing but 2,500 crystals and the weight of a scandalous secret. To 40 million viewers, those breathy whispers of happy birthday were a public confession of an illicit love. But behind the shimmering facade of the world's greatest sex symbol was a woman unraveling in real time. Within 3 months, she would be dead. Within 15, so would he. This wasn't a celebration. It was a haunting swan song for two American icons marked for tragedy. To understand the ghost-like figure that shimmied onto the stage that night in May 1962, we have to look past the rhinestones and into the wreckage of the year that preceded it. Marilyn Monroe was the undisputed queen of Hollywood, but by the dawn of the 60s, her throne was beginning to feel like a cage. Her latest film, The Misfits, had flopped at the box office, and her high-profile marriage to playwright Arthur Miller had disintegrated into a bitter divorce. She wasn't just losing her grip on her career. She was losing her grip on herself. A grueling gallbladder surgery and a traumatic stay at a Manhattan psychiatric hospital had left her physically depleted and emotionally raw. The industry she had built began to view her as a liability, a fragile porcelain doll that was cracking under the pressure of its own fame. Yet, as the spring of 1962 arrived, there was a flickering light of hope. Marilyn moved into a quiet home in Brentwood, Los Angeles, and signed on for a new film, Something's Got to Give. She was ready for a comeback, but fate had already placed her on a collision course with the most powerful family in America. The rumors of a liaison between the blonde bombshell and President John F. Kennedy didn't start in the halls of Madison Square Garden. They began in the desert heat of Palm Springs. In late March, just months before the gala, Marilyn and the president spent a weekend at the home of Bing Crosby. While history often paints this as a grand sweeping romance, those closest to Marilyn tell a far more grounded story. It wasn't a deep love affair. It was a singular, clandestine encounter between two people who lived their lives in the blinding glare of the public eye. Marilyn's personal masseur, Ralph Roberts, later recalled a phone call from her that weekend. In the background, he heard the unmistakable Bostonian accent of the commander-in-chief, who apparently stepped in to ask for professional advice on his chronic back pain. It was a moment of surreal domesticity for two people who were anything but ordinary. For Marilyn, the secrecy was a thrill, a piece of high-stakes drama that fed her need for validation. But for Kennedy, it was a momentary diversion, an invitation extended on a whim to a Democratic fundraiser in New York. He wanted a star, and he knew exactly which one could light up the room. As the date of the fundraiser approached, Marilyn's anxiety began to spiral. She left the set of her new film, much to the fury of 20th Century Fox, and retreated into 2 days of intense rehearsals in New York. She was obsessed with the details, specifically a dress designed by Jean-Louis that was so tight it had to be sewn onto her naked body. It was flesh-colored, embedded with thousands of crystals, and designed to give the illusion that she was wearing nothing at all. She was preparing to present herself as the ultimate gift to the most powerful man on earth, unaware that the studio was already preparing to destroy her for her absence. The night of May 19th was a chaotic blur of Hollywood royalty and political heavyweights. Legends like Ella Fitzgerald and Bobby Darin graced the stage, but the atmosphere was thick with a specific kind of tension. Actor Peter Lawford, the president's brother-in-law, spent the evening mocking Marilyn's notorious reputation for being late. He introduced her repeatedly throughout the night, only to gesture toward an empty stage and move on to the next guest. It was a cruel joke played at the expense of a woman who was backstage, trembling, struggling to find the courage to step into the light for what would be her final, most iconic performance. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, the late Marilyn Monroe finally appeared, and the world held its breath as she shed her white ermine stole. In that moment, the 15,000 people in the arena truly believed they were about to see everything. Little did they know, they were witnessing the beginning of the end. When Marilyn finally materialized on that stage, she didn't just walk. She shimmied with a calculated, fragile grace that paralyzed the room. As she shed her white ermine stole, a collective gasp swept through the 15,000 spectators. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlights, the Jean-Louis gown vanished against her skin. The thousands of hand-sewn rhinestones caught the light, making her appear as if she were wrapped in nothing but a shimmering mist. For one heart-stopping second, the audience believed they were witnessing the ultimate Hollywood transgression, a naked starlet standing before the President of the United States. Then came the voice. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible in a venue as cavernous as Madison Square Garden, a soft, breathy, almost painfully intimate croon that felt like a whispered secret shared in a dark room. "Happy birthday to you," she began, her delivery so sultry yet strangely childlike that it transcended a simple song. She wasn't just singing to a politician, she was performing an act of public seduction. This wasn't the polished powerhouse vocal of a Broadway star. It was the raw, vulnerable sound of a woman who knew exactly how to weaponize her own magnetism. As she gained steam, encouraged by the roars of the crowd, she transitioned into a reworked version of "Thanks for the Memory." The lyrics, which she had personally penned, lauded Kennedy's handling of U.S. Steel and Our Problems by the Ton. It was a bizarre fusion of high-stakes politics and low-cut glamour. To the millions watching at home, it was the confirmation of every tabloid rumor they had ever whispered. Journalist Dorothy Kilgallen famously described the moment as making love to the president in the direct view of 40 million Americans. The air in the arena was thick with a scandal that felt both inevitable and terrifying. When the performance ended and a massive birthday cake was wheeled out, the president himself took to the mic to deliver what would become one of his most famous quips. "I can now retire from politics," JFK joked, after having had "Happy Birthday" sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way. The crowd erupted in laughter, but beneath the wit there was a sense of finality. Kennedy was a master of optics, and while he played along with the joke, the sheer heat of Marilyn's performance had created a PR firestorm that even a Kennedy couldn't fully contain. But as the lights dimmed and the gala moved toward its after-party, the sweet and wholesome facade began to crack. Behind the scenes, Marilyn was vibrating with a mixture of triumph and terror. She had given the performance of her life, but in doing so, she had crossed an invisible line. She had made the private public, and in the world of the Kennedys, that was an unpardonable sin. This singular minute of television history would become her most enduring legacy, yet it was also the moment the trap finally snapped shut. The morning after the gala, the high of New York City evaporated, replaced by the cold, clinical reality of Hollywood power plays. Marilyn returned to Los Angeles to resume filming Something's Got to Give, but she wasn't returning to a hero's welcome. At 20th Century Fox, the executives were seething. They saw her trip to New York not as a patriotic tribute, but as a blatant act of professional desertion. The film was already weeks behind schedule and millions over budget, and the studio bosses were looking for a scapegoat to cover their own mismanagement. Marilyn's health was failing her in ways the public couldn't see. She was battling a chronic case of sinusitis and a deepening dependency on the barbiturates she used to numb her skyrocketing anxiety. She was a woman drowning in a sea of expectations, yet the studio had no empathy for its most valuable asset. They used her pre-planned absence for the JFK Gala as the ultimate ammunition, firing her from the project and suing her for $500,000 for breach of contract. The headline, "Fox Fires Marilyn," sent shockwaves through the industry, signaling to the world that the blonde bombshell was no longer untouchable. While the lawyers traded blows, a single grainy photograph was being developed in a darkroom, a photo that would eventually become the holy grail of 20th century conspiracy theories. It was taken at a crowded after-party at the home of movie executive Arthur Krim. In it, Marilyn stands in that famous dress, talking to both John and Robert Kennedy. It is the only known photograph of Marilyn and the president together. The image is hauntingly candid. They aren't looking at the camera, but rather into a future that neither would live to see. It was the last time she would ever see the man she had just serenaded before the eyes of the world. The rejection from the studio, combined with the sudden silence from the Kennedy camp, sent Marilyn into a downward spiral. She retreated into the sanctuary of her new Brentwood home, a place she called Cursum Perficio, Latin for "my journey ends here." She spent her days in a drug-induced haze, oscillating between desperate attempts to get her job back and paranoid fears that she was being watched. The happy birthday performance, which should have been her crowning achievement, had instead become a neon sign marking her as a liability to the most powerful men in the country. Even as Fox eventually blinked, attempting to rehire her after her co-star Dean Martin refused to film without her, the damage was done. The woman who had shimmered at Madison Square Garden was being hollowed out from the inside. She was no longer a person. She was a piece of pop culture property being fought over by lawyers, studio heads, and political fixers. As the summer of 1962 reached its peak, the girl who had once dreamed of being the next Jean Harlow found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The clock was now ticking toward August 5th, a date that would change the American landscape forever. But before the final curtain fell, there were still pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. Secrets whispered in the dark that suggested Marilyn knew much more than she was letting on. There is a chilling irony that hangs over that night in New York, a slip of the tongue that felt less like a joke and more like a grim prophecy. When Peter Lawford introduced her for the final time as the late Marilyn Monroe, he was mocking her habitual tardiness, a trait that had become her trademark and her curse. But just 78 days later, that title would transition from a backstage jab to a global headline. On August 5th, 1962, the woman who had captivated 15,000 people at the Garden was found lifeless in her small Brentwood home, a victim of a probable suicide by acute barbiturate poisoning. She was only 36 years old. The scene in her bedroom was a stark contrast to the glittering gala. There were no crystals, no spotlights, only an empty bottle of Nembutal and a tangle of unkept sheets. The news of her death didn't just break the heart of the public, it shattered the illusion of the perfect Hollywood dream. As the media descended on her home, the questions began to swirl almost immediately. Was it an accident? A deliberate act of despair? Or was she a woman who knew too much, silenced by the very men who had once invited her into their inner circle? The shadow of the Kennedy family loomed large over the investigation. Conspiracy theorists pointed to the happy birthday performance as the moment Marilyn had flown too close to the sun. They whispered about missing phone logs and secret visits from Bobby Kennedy on the night she died. While the official autopsy pointed to a self-administered overdose, the lack of a suicide note and the inconsistencies in the witnesses' stories created a vacuum that the public filled with suspicion. The tragedy was compounded 15 months later when an assassin's bullet in Dallas claimed the life of John F. Kennedy, ensuring that the truth of their relationship would be buried in 2 early graves. In the decades since, the link between the fallen star and the martyred president has become a cornerstone of American mythology. They were 2 of the most attractive, most famous, and most tragic figures of the 20th century, and their fates seemed inextricably linked by that 1 minute of television. But as the sensationalist tabloids began to churn out stories of secret diaries and hidden pregnancies, the real woman behind the blonde bombshell persona was slowly erased. The world didn't want the truth, they wanted the scandal. Yet, if we strip away the rumors and the doctored photographs, what remains is the story of a woman who was desperately trying to be seen for more than her body. She had used that birthday performance to show the world she was still a star, unaware that she was actually signaling her own exit. The question that still haunts historians isn't just how she died, but how she lived those final weeks, caught between a dying career and a dangerous flirtation with power. For over 60 years, the narrative has been fixed in the public imagination, a long-standing torrid affair between the commander-in-chief and the Hollywood icon. It's a story fueled by the breathy intimacy of that happy birthday song and the countless tabloid covers that followed. But when you peel back the layers of gossip and look at the documented history, a much more clinical and perhaps more tragic picture emerges. According to most serious historians, including Marilyn's acclaimed biographer Donald Spotto, the grand affair was likely nothing more than a single fleeting encounter. The most plausible, and likely only, night of physical intimacy between them occurred in late March 1962 at Bing Crosby's home in Palm Springs. This was the weekend where Marilyn's masseur, Ralph Roberts, famously heard the president's voice in the background of a phone call. According to those closest to her, Marilyn didn't view the encounter as a grand romance. She loved the drama and the secrecy of sleeping with a charismatic president. But she was clear-eyed about the reality. Kennedy was not the man she wanted to spend her life with. For the president, the night in Palm Springs was likely a momentary diversion, a perk of his power. It was here that the invitation to the New York Gala was likely extended, a casual request made in the heat of a desert night that would lead to one of the most scrutinized moments in history. To Kennedy, she was a celebrity guest for a fundraiser. To Marilyn, it was an opportunity to feel important, to feel connected to the center of the world. Neither of them could have predicted that this one night would fuel decades of relentless speculation and doctored evidence. The tragedy isn't that they were secret lovers. It's that they were two people who were profoundly lonely despite their fame, finding a brief, hollow connection that the world would eventually twist into a grand conspiracy. But as the rumors grew louder, the physical artifacts of that relationship began to take on a life of their own. The dress that gave the illusion of nakedness was about to undergo a transformation of its own, from a piece of clothing to a multi-million-dollar relic. Beyond the breathy vocals and the whispered scandals, the most tangible legacy of that night at the Garden was the garment itself, a shimmering second skin that has since become the most expensive piece of clothing in history. Designed by the legendary Jean-Louis, the flesh-colored marquisette gown was a feat of both engineering and audacity. It was embedded with more than 2,500 hand-stitched rhinestones, strategically placed to catch the light while revealing nothing and everything all at once. Marilyn had paid $12,000 for the dress in 1962, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to over $100,000 today. It was an investment in her own legend, a costume designed to ensure that no one, not even the president, could look away. The gown was so impossibly tight that Marilyn had to be sewn into it moments before she stepped on stage. She couldn't wear undergarments. She had to be the dress, and the dress had to be her. This wasn't just fashion. It was a psychological weapon. It projected an image of a woman who was entirely exposed, yet unreachable. But as the years passed after her death, the dress transformed from a garment of seduction into a cold, hard asset of the memorabilia market. In 2016, it went under the hammer at Julien's auctions, where the winning bid reached a staggering $4.8 million. The buyer was the museum chain Ripley's Believe It or Not, whose vice president, Edward Meyer, simply stated that it was the most iconic piece of pop culture in existence. But why does a piece of fabric command the price of a kingdom? It is because the dress is the only surviving witness to a moment that was never supposed to happen. It carries the microscopic remnants of the sweat, the perfume, and the desperate ambition of a woman who was trying to buy back her relevance with rhinestones. When Kim Kardashian controversially wore the original gown to the Met Gala decades later, the public outcry was visceral. It felt like a desecration of a holy relic, a reminder that while the dress could be worn by others, the haunting magnetism of the woman who first shimmered in it could never be replicated. Marilyn's final months were a masterclass in tragic isolation. She spent her days behind the gates of her Brentwood home, her world shrinking to the size of a telephone and a prescription bottle. The late Marilyn Monroe joke from the gala had become a grim daily reality as she struggled to keep appointments, her mind clouded by an ever-increasing dosage of barbiturates. She was a woman caught in a feedback loop of anxiety and dependency, reaching out to friends like Susan Strasberg and Ralph Roberts, searching for a version of herself that no longer existed. She was trapped in the blinding spotlight that eventually burns everything it touches. Today, we look back at that night in 1962 not as a celebration, but as the final peak before a catastrophic fall. The performance remains one of Monroe's most enduring moments because it serves as a reminder of her incredible power to captivate, even while she was breaking apart. It was the moment the legend was perfected and the human being was lost. But as we examine the ruins of their lives, we have to ask, was the price of that one iconic minute worth the tragedy that followed? In the end, the secret behind Happy Birthday, Mr. President, wasn't a hidden pregnancy or a cabinet-level conspiracy. The secret was the crushing weight of a woman trying to survive in a world that only wanted her to shine. Marilyn was a master of the mask, but that night at the Garden, the mask was at its thinnest. She was a woman who had been fired, divorced, and institutionalized, yet she stood there and convinced 40 million people that she was the happiest woman on earth. It was her greatest performance. And it was her last. The world saw a goddess. Marilyn saw a way to say goodbye without anyone even realizing she was leaving. The rumors of an affair continue to persist because they humanize the icons. We want to believe that the beautiful movie star and the charismatic president shared a love that was too big for the world to handle. But the truth, the single night in Palm Springs and the subsequent silence, is perhaps even more tragic. It suggests that these two figures were essentially strangers who briefly collided, leaving behind a trail of glitter and unanswered questions. As the years turn into decades, the performance remains frozen in time, a shimmering reminder that, in the blinding light of fame, it's often impossible to tell the difference between a celebration and a cry for help. But even as the players in this drama have long since passed into legend, their ghosts continue to haunt the halls of history, leaving us to wonder if the most iconic moment in pop culture was actually the first scene of a national tragedy. Today, the names Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy are etched into the stone of American mythology, forever linked by a performance that lasted less than a minute. Marilyn remains the ultimate symbol of fragile beauty, her face appearing on everything from high-end art to cheap souvenirs, while her tragic end serves as a cautionary tale about the price of the spotlight. Kennedy's legacy is one of Camelot lost, a vision of a future that was cut short in Dallas just over a year after he joked about retiring from politics. They are both frozen in our collective memory at the height of their powers, forever young and forever out of reach. The Happy Birthday dress now sits behind glass in a museum, a $4.8 million relic of a night that changed everything. It serves as a silent witness to a moment of pure, unadulterated stardom, but also as a reminder of the human being who was once sewn into its seams. Marilyn's journey ended in a quiet room in Brentwood, while the president's ended on a street in Texas. They left behind a world that is still trying to decode the secrets of that night at Madison Square Garden, searching for a truth that likely died with them in the early 60s. The enduring power of this story lies in its vulnerability. Behind the crystals and the political speeches were two people struggling with the immense pressures of their own legends. If there is a message to be found in the wreckage of their lives, it is that fame is a flickering candle, and the brightest flames often burn out the fastest. We remember the song, we remember the dress, but we must also remember the person who was just looking for a wholesome way to say happy birthday. Thank you for joining us as we delved into the secrets behind Hollywood's most scandalous night. If you found this journey through history compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the lives of icons who shaped our world. We want to hear from you. Do you think the happy birthday performance was a public confession or just a masterclass in Hollywood showmanship? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Comments below. Comments below. Comments below.